I'm Dom Nicholls, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, as Friedrich Merz suffers a humiliating and unexpected setback on his way to becoming German Chancellor, we report how the Kremlin is preparing for Friday's Victory Day parade, all while nervously watching the skies for Ukrainian drones after 2 successive nights of attacks on Moscow.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
It's the worst carnage that this world has seen since World War II.
Absolutely fascinating.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Tuesday, the 6th of May, 3 years and 72 days since the full-scale invasion began, and today I'm joined by the Telegraph's executive editor for audio, Francis Dearnley, and Ash Bhardwaj, an award-winning journalist, broadcaster and author who specialises in blending defence, security and travel journalism. Well, let's start in Russia. Moscow was forced to close all of its airports last night after the Russian capital was targeted by a swarm of Ukrainian drones for a second night in a row. Moscow's mayor, Sergei Sobyanin, said at least 19 Ukrainian drones had been destroyed on their approach to Moscow, quote, from different directions. He said it caused no major destruction or injuries. However, flights were halted at all 4 airports serving Moscow and several others for a number of hours. I think about 9 other regional airports were closed. This comes from Russia's aviation watchdog. Now, last night's attack follows similar strikes yesterday, so overnight Sunday, Monday, that also disrupted flights into the city. Obviously, all comes ahead of Friday's Victory Day parade in Moscow, at which Xi Jinping, among other world leaders, are going to be attending. Xi is expected to be arriving tomorrow, I think, in Moscow. Just speaking about the Victory Day parade briefly, the Kremlin has not ruled out that North Korean troops will take part in the Red Square parade. Of the other world leaders, Robert Fico, the Slovakian Prime Minister, said he would be going for the occasion, despite the EU's top diplomat, Kai Kallas, warning countries from the EU against attending. Now, Mr. Fico was going, then he said he was unwell, now he's going again. Apparently yesterday he posted a picture of himself wild swimming to prove that he was healthy and probably also to taunt journalists. Uncertainty still, however, surrounds Alexander Vučić, the Serbian president, who has pledged to attend, but also suddenly, mysteriously, rather conveniently, has fallen ill. Alexander Lukashenko, the Belarusian leader, he's expected to be there, as always, knows which side his bread is buttered, as will Nicolás Maduro from Venezuela and Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. Now, the Kremlin is clearly nervous about the event, hence this panicky 3-day ceasefire that Putin is demanding, and a number of events have been cancelled. A number of commemorative events for World War II anniversary have been cancelled in occupied Crimea due to safety concerns. So also overnight Sunday, Monday, the other big news from the weekend was that Ukrainian forces seem to have pushed over the border again in the vicinity of Tekhino. That's in Kursk Oblast, about 60 k's west of Suja. Now, almost certainly as a preliminary phase of that operation, the Ukrainian General Staff said on Sunday that their forces had hit a Russian reconnaissance and strike drone command post near Tekhino, killing up to about 20 Russian soldiers, they estimate. The head of Ukraine's Centre for Countering Disinformation, Andrei Kovalenko, said Russian forces have been training drone operators at that school in Tekhino since 2022. Anyway, this attack, it doesn't seem to have gone very far, but it has happened. They're over the border. They're in Russia, much to Putin's annoyance and embarrassment. The main attack seems to have come on Sunday night. Russian sources said Ukraine had intensified drone strikes and artillery fire against Tekhino throughout Sunday night before attacking towards the town. Russian mill bloggers said Ukrainian forces had used mine-clearing equipment to create a path through Russian minefields along the border there. Now, if that's accurate, that's very interesting. That's a big failure by Russia's land forces. The threat along the border there is well known. Ukraine has obviously tried in the past and tried in this area in the past. So all obstacles there should be covered by fire. It's no good just having a minefield and hoping that stops the enemy. It might slow them down. But if you've got the time to work through a minefield, you can do it. It's just a tactical speed bump. Now, as I said, I'm not sure if the Ukrainian force is still there or has made a probing attack and then withdrawn back across the border. But Russian sources have said that elements of the Russian 98th Airborne Division, so part of the VDV, the Airborne Forces, likely referring here to the 5th Anti-Aircraft Missile Regiment, as well as other military personnel and Russian border guards, are defending against these attacks. Russian mill bloggers said Ukraine had destroyed a bridge over the Seam River just to the northeast. I think that's one of the 3 bridges you may remember over the river in that area. They were repeatedly struck when Ukraine first launched an incursion into Kursk Oblast last August. Russia kept rebuilding, or at the very least putting in floating pontoon bridges in order to keep resupplying their troops in the area, make sure they weren't cut off. But Ukraine kept hitting those pontoon bridges as well. Anyway, other Russian mill bloggers said that Ukrainian forces are also using drones to hit Russian logistics in the area. A lot of that reporting comes from the ISW, the Institute for the Study of War. Now, what we do know is that power is yet to be restored to the town of Rilsk. That's about 50 kilometres northeast of Tetkino, after Ukrainian forces hit a substation nearby late yesterday, damaging 2 transformers. That comes from local Russian authorities. Moscow claims to have defeated the incursion, but local authorities have evacuated Kursk residents who live near the border. Ukraine's military has not commented directly on the reports, but said it was still actively fighting in the region. As ever, there's the fog of war. We're not exactly sure what is happening now, but we've got a good idea about what has happened. Alexander Kinstein, who's the Kursk region's governor, said Ukraine's forces targeted civilians in this attack, killing 3 people and injuring 7. He said yesterday and tonight alone, 7 people were hospitalised due to attacks by the Ukrainian armed forces and 3 more died. Now, I'm in no way belittling or mocking civilian loss. I just note that in the same time period, at least 5 people were killed and 33 injured across Ukraine yesterday in Russian attacks. And no comment as far as I can see from Mr. Kinstein about that. Elsewhere over the weekend, another really interesting point, small, very, very sub-tactical, but what does it mean for the direction of warfare? Ukraine's military intelligence agency said they used the Magura-7C drone, their invention, to shoot down 2 Russian Su-30 fighter jets. The second jet's crew is presumed dead. This comes from the GOR chief, Kirill Bogdanov, General Bogdanov, giving an interview to The War Zone. Now, Russian telegram channels appear to corroborate the first one, the shoot-down of the first one at least, saying the crew parachuted and had been picked up by a ship in the Black Sea. That first jet was said to have been shot down near Novorossiysk, the Russian Black Sea coast, with video evidence released of that. President Zelensky confirmed the second was destroyed over occupied Crimea. General Bogdanov said no footage exists for that incident. He said whilst the first crew were picked up by a civilian vessel, the second likely perished. Now, these Magura-7 drones, they're an air defence variant of the Magura-5, those seaborne, those maritime drones that have been going around spanking into the side of Russian ships. So these the 7 Magura-7 drones, they've got Sidewinder missiles, the AIM-9 Sidewinder. They've been laying onto Russian jets, and this is the first time that we know of a sea drone has brought down a fighter jet. So what does that, what does that show for the direction of warfare? Otherwise, over the weekend, there was minimal movement on the ground. When I say minimal, I mean there is still some, clearly, but I'm not able to go over every single little action. There were, I think, over 1,480 Russian casualties yesterday, as per the General Staff of the Ukrainian Armed Forces. Now, what movement there was mostly in the Donbass. Additional ISW reporting says that Russia recently redeployed elements of the 68th Army Corps and 58th Combined Arms Army from the Kharkiv region and western Zaporizhia towards the kind of line between Toretsk and Pokrovsk. Now, Pokrovsk is about 40 k's north of Kharkiv, so it's not a massive movement of personnel, but we know they've been trying to push into that town for months now. Geolocated footage published yesterday shows Russian forces recently advanced southwest of Toretsk using platoon-sized mechanised assault, so a platoon of about 30 soldiers, mechanised being armoured vehicles and possibly not tanks, but maybe armoured personnel carriers. Now, Ukraine's the head of the armed forces, General Alexander Syrsky, commenting about this morning, said we've been able to stabilise the situation in this zone of operations and in some places have seized back the tactical initiative. Now then, still working our way through the weekend, possibly as part of the weekend's first drone attack on Moscow and also overnight Sunday, Monday. I think notable for how technology has moved on, particularly homegrown Ukrainian technology. Ukraine broke its record for the longest strike within Russia, hitting a target nearly 3,000 kilometres from the front lines, 2,679 kilometres to be exact, with a long-range drone. Now, interesting that. I wonder if it suggests Russia is pulling air defence either out of Ukraine or prioritising what air defence there is inside Russia to protect Moscow ahead of this week's May Day parade on Friday. Okay, elsewhere on the weekend, on Saturday, Ukraine's regional prosecutors said that Russian forces had used drones armed with thermobaric warheads in a mass attack on Kharkiv on Friday that injured at least 51 people, including 2 children. The Kharkiv Regional Prosecutor's Office said in a statement that the strike involved at least 15 loitering munitions. They thought the Shahid-type Geran-2 drones, that's the Russian variant of the Iranian drone. 4 districts of Kharkiv came under fire, igniting numerous fires, and investigators found that some of the drones contained thermobaric munitions, thermobaric being the sort of fuel-air explosive that creates a massive overpressure. So for a small initial strike in a building, for example, it can cause devastating injuries and deaths elsewhere in the building by creating an overpressure, and it can collapse buildings and bunkers very easily. President Zelensky said there were not and could not be any military targets. Russia is hitting residential buildings at the very time when Ukrainians are at home, when they are putting their children to bed. Only tyrants can give such orders and carry them out. That last report by the Kyiv Independent. Then a couple more for me. On Sunday, President Zelensky and Czech President Petr said that the Czech Republic will establish a school to train Ukrainian F-16 pilots, or Ukrainian pilots on the F-16s, I should say, outside of Ukraine. Now, on the same day, the US Department of State approved a $310 million worth program for F-16 training, equipment and support services for Ukraine. Additionally, President Zelensky said that the Czech Ammunition Initiative is on course to deliver 1.8 million artillery shells to Ukraine this year, and that Ukraine is expecting its allies to deliver 3 million in total in 2025. Now, that initiative, the Ammunition Initiative, you'll remember it's one of those 8 capability coalitions where different countries take the lead for developing certain military capabilities, artillery, tanks and so on. Czech Republic are leading on the provision of artillery. Now, just to bring us up to date, last night, Ukraine shot down 54 of the 136 Russian drones fired at the country overnight, according to the Air Force. Kharkiv was hit again in a massive Shahid drone attack. One of those UAVs struck the Barabashovo market in the northeast of the city, quite close to the centre, but towards the northeast. That's a very large shopping centre. In total, the city was hit 20 times overnight, leaving 4 injured. And this morning, freelance journalist Tim White says that Russia's MOD has said it's destroyed another 25 Ukrainian drones this morning across various regions near the border, Ukraine's northeast border. According to Tim, Moscow says that between 9:30 and 13:10 local Moscow time, 7 drones were shot down in Kursk Oblast, 15 in the Oryol region, that's to the north, and another 3 in Bryansk to the northwest. And as Tim says, the point I made earlier, this might be either Russia withdrawing air defence back towards Moscow and/or Ukraine looking for the gaps in the air defence umbrella as assets are moved around. And just very, very finally, to point you to a report that's out today from Latvia's Military Intelligence and Security Service. They say that Russian military behaviour in the Baltic Sea region is, quote, increasing the threat of accidental military incidents. Never a good thing. So, like I say, this is Latvia's Military Intelligence and Security Service in their annual report, saying that Russia is using aggressive tactics such as unauthorised airspace incursions and close encounters with NATO ships and aircraft, which we've reported on numerous times on this podcast. The report says the purpose of the provocations is most likely to intimidate and test the potential opponent, while attempts to discredit the reactions and defence capabilities of the countries of the region are not excluded. Yes, we don't like accidental military incidents because they can very, very easily spiral into something much more significant. So quite a busy weekend, Francis, and not only on the military side, but what else on the diplomatic front?
Well, thanks very much, Dom. You mentioned hawkish heartthrob Petropavl there. Don't worry, Kai, you're still my number one. And I'm going to start, though, with breaking news out of Europe this morning that another hawk, Friedrich Merz, leader of the German Conservatives, has suffered what our Berlin correspondent James Rothwell is calling a humiliating and unexpected setback in Parliament, failing to win a majority vote to become Chancellor. Earlier this morning, German MPs held a secret ballot to elect the country's next leader in what was supposed to be a formality, but amid gasps in the chamber of the Bundestag, fell short of the majority required to become Chancellor by just 6 votes, an unprecedented sign of dissent from his party and its coalition allies. Shocked politicians then filed out for urgent talks amid speculation in the German press that some MPs had rebelled due to policy disagreements with Merz. You'll recall that Merz had overseen some controversial policies. After his election victory, he used the old German parliament to pass reforms that made the debt brake, Germany's strict limit on borrowing, no longer apply to major defence projects. He also created a €500 billion special infrastructure fund by taking on huge government debt. As we discussed with James recently on the podcast, German politicians are not fully behind such projects, and this vote would speak to that. Plus, one of the critiques that's been made of Mr. Merz, that he lacks some of the political finesse required to win over MPs in one-on-one persuasion, and is not always as artful as some politicians in bringing people round and massaging egos. It is hardly a promising start to his tenure and will come as a blow to those in Europe hoping for a strong, unified Germany with regard to foreign policy. President Obama, in his memoirs, talks about how acquiring political power is like purchasing a new car. As soon as you drive it out of the showroom, its value diminishes rapidly. And so to start with a defeat does not bode well. Although, at the same time, you look at leaders like William Pitt the Younger, Abraham Lincoln, 2 leaders with tenures that were widely considered successful and their power increased over time. But they began terribly. So nothing is predestined. But it already will have consequences. Sources have told the German media that there will be no second round of voting today, which means that Merz's schedule for the rest of this week, which included trips to Paris, Brussels and Warsaw, have now been thrown into disarray, as his party seeks to hold another vote later in the week and find out who has withheld their support and why now. Now, sticking with Europe, we saw another election this weekend in Romania, which saw right-wing nationalist candidate George Simeon win a resounding victory in the first round of that presidential election with 40% of the vote. There'll be a runoff on the 18th, I think, where there will be another rival, the Liberal mayor of Bucharest, in the mix, although Mr. Simeon will now be the clear favourite to win. Now, it follows the annulment, you'll remember, of the previous first round held in November when Romania's constitutional court invalidated the outcome due to evidence of social media manipulation and foreign interference by Russia. That round had been won by populist Călin Georgescu, who promoted conspiracy theories and called Ukraine a fictional state, for instance. But Simeon is not much better and was banned from entering Ukraine in November last year over his systematic anti-Ukrainian activities, leading a party opposed, for instance, to sending weapons to Kyiv and against transferring Romanian Patriot air defence systems to the country. So, in short, Romania may soon classify as another country in the European Union, alongside Hungary and Slovakia, which is a barrier to certain pro-Ukraine initiatives, especially sanctions and weapons provisions. So we'll have to monitor this closely. One last story on Europe before we turn to the United States and Russia. Tony Diver, associate political editor here at The Telegraph, been on the podcast many times, has an exclusive story on Britain's secret plans preparing for a direct military attack by Russia amid fears that it's not ready for war. Officials have been asked to update 20-year-old contingency plans that would put the country on a war footing after threats of attack by the Kremlin. A classified dossier will set out how the government would respond to a declaration of war, including bunkers to protect the cabinet and the royal family, public service broadcasts, and the stockpiling of resources. Now, this may sound far-fetched to some, but bear in mind many countries in Europe, as we've reported, are dusting off their old Cold War worst-case scenario plans. And Kremlin officials have repeatedly threatened the UK with a direct attack over its support for Ukraine, which may soon include British troops on the ground. It's not beyond the realms of possibility. Experts warn that the UK is especially vulnerable to an assault on its critical national infrastructure, including gas terminals, undersea cables, nuclear power plants, and transport hubs. And I think that's the key here. Hostile powers don't, after all, need to launch invasions to start wars. Just look at Pearl Harbor and the attempt to nullify the American Navy in one strike. That might be the kind of situation one could see, if not for Britain, then for another European country in this context. It doesn't have to be tanks rolling across a border. Now, let's turn to the evolving position of the United States next. Last week, I hypothesised that the true measure of Moscow's concerns about the direction of travel following the signing of the minerals deal and the weapons being sent by Washington to Kyiv would be found in a desire by Moscow to repair damage with a direct interaction between President Trump and Putin. Well, yesterday, Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said that a meeting between the two was necessary and had not been scheduled yet. To quote him, "Such a meeting is clearly on the radar and in many ways. We believe it must be prepared appropriately, and this requires efforts at a variety of expert levels." In other words, and I should stress this is my interpretation, we need to reclaim some of the ground we have lost in recent weeks in the political realm. And the easiest way to do that is to get Trump and Putin to interact as soon as possible. Based on past experience, one would have to say that is not an unwise strategy. Now, on Friday, we heard how the US was looking to step back from being the principal arbiter between the two sides, though it's hard to gauge how much this is simply wishing to apply pressure versus being an actual threat. On Saturday, Trump reiterated to NBC that the US may consider implementing additional sanctions against Russia if it does not reach a peace deal. When asked if Trump would sign a sanctions bill touted by Senator Lindsey Graham, Trump said it depends on whether or not Russia is behaving towards coming to a peace. Apparently, at least 72 US senators are prepared to vote for a sanctions package against Russia and massive tariffs on countries supporting Moscow. That came directly from Mr. Graham. Now, when asked if Trump believes the parties are close to establishing a peace deal, Trump said that "I do believe we're closer with one party and maybe not as close with the other, but we'll have to see. I'd like to not say which one we're closer to." Also at the weekend, in a conversation with Turkey's Erdogan, Trump discussed the war and said afterwards he was looking forward to working with President Erdogan on getting the ridiculous but deadly war between Russia and Ukraine ended now. Bear in mind, Turkey has consistently said it was opposed to any territory being legally ceded to Putin as part of any deal. So you take all of that together and it would point to the fact that the US is not imminently about to completely withdraw from this process. But again, things are so changeable. Europe has to prepare, and Russia, of course, for any outcome, I think, in the next few weeks. But let's end with Russia and its preparations for Victory Day. That parade, as Dom mentioned, in occupied Crimea was cancelled as a consequence of safety risks. No surprise given the activities of the Ukrainian resistance, which we continue to report on every other Friday. But many are wondering whether the Ukrainians will try and do something to disrupt activities in Moscow itself this week. There are risks of doing so in terms of the perceptions around peace talks, but we'll be talking about that in more detail tomorrow. I started with the Bundestag and I'll end with the building that houses that parliament today, albeit in a very different context. Russia has built a life-sized replica of the Reichstag building to hold Victory Day reenactments of its famous capture by Soviet forces in the Second World War. It's quite something, this. Filmmakers aligned with the Kremlin constructed the building in an amusement park in Moscow to hold a play retelling the moment the Soviet flag was hoisted above Germany's Parliament building in the final days of the war. Some are reading it as yet more evidence of Victory Day becoming more overtly propagandistic, militaristic and antagonistic towards Europe. If things escalate, as many predict, in the years ahead, historians will point to stories like this as signalling what many ignored with regard to the state that Russia has increasingly become. In Britain yesterday, the first commemorations for Victory in Europe Day took place. I watched the flypast, which started with a Lancaster bomber and then a few current generation military aircraft. But I would say that the tone was still very much predicated on the idea of peace. And that's very, very different from what we have seen in the preparations taking place in Moscow. It's not about peace. This is about showing Russia's military power. And just contrast that with the very small detachment of Ukrainian soldiers who marched past Buckingham Palace yesterday with the thousands upon thousands of soldiers that we're going to see, I think, as part of the commemorations in Moscow.
Thanks, Francis. When I saw that thing about them building a replica of the Reichstag, I mean, I know we do like a bit of dressing up here. We got the VE80 celebrations, if that's the right word, happening. It started yesterday, really, and yeah, there were some genuine World War II vintage vehicles and half tracks and all the rest of it. So we're not. Well, maybe we are a million miles away from it, but to go build a blooming theatrical stage. They're just cosplaying. It's going to be interesting to see what happens Friday. I'm going to be with Oksana Pijik. We're going to be live streaming Russia's May the 9th parade, Victory Day parade, on Friday. I think it starts at 10 a.m. local British time, about midday Moscow time. Anyway, we'll be putting that out on our YouTube channel, and she and I will be commentating on it. So do join us there if you can. But I'm now delighted to turn to our guest, Ash Bhardwaj, author and journalist. I didn't quite know how to sum it up, Ash, about defence, security, travel, mindfulness. It's all good stuff. I just didn't really know what wrapper to put around it. But among other things, this might explain it, Francis. Among other things, Ash has walked 1,000 kilometres through Uganda and Sudan along the Nile. He's written and presented the BBC Radio 4 documentaries How Ukraine Made Us Care, NATO's newest member, and Britain's shrinking army. And you were nearly killed when our friend Lev Wood got you lost in Nepal. Was it Nepal? India. Okay. Now, your book, you've got a book out, Why We Travel, about to launch this book, Why We Travel, A Journey into Human Motivation. It's a blend of memoir, travelogue, interviews, advice, exploring how to travel better. I like the phrase, we shouldn't switch off when we travel. That's when we should switch on. And we can talk about that in a minute. I want to focus on the 8,500 kilometres you travelled along Russia's European border some years ago, including through the Donbass and occupied Crimea, which became the Telegraph podcast series Edgelands. But let's start with you illegally cycling through a forest in Belarus to get a look at the Vistuli Mansion. Now, what is the Vistuli Mansion? Why is it so significant? And what were you doing there in the first place? Ash, welcome.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Francis. Great to see you guys. So Vistuli is a mansion in the Białowieża forest, which is this ancient woodland that is on the Polish-Belarusian border. And it was where in December 1991, the leaders of Russia, Belarus and Ukraine came together to sign the accords that ended the Soviet Union. I was in Belarus in 2018 and I really wanted to see this place. This is part of this journey you mentioned, which had been triggered by me working as an infantry officer with the British Army in Estonia and becoming very interested in the end of World War II, the rise of the Soviet Union and its occupation of Central and Eastern Europe. And I wanted to go and see this place, and I'd got to the Białowieża forest, and I'd briefly been questioned by a person with a KGB badge. The KGB is still the Internal Security Service of Belarus, asking what I was doing there. And I was telling him I was just really interested in history. I wanted to go and see this inflection point with the rise of Belarusian national identity. He said, well, you can't go to the Vistuli Mansion. It's like run down. There's nothing happening there. And I was like, oh, great. Sounds much more interesting. So I got on a bike, cycled off into the forest, may have gone past a couple of gates, and I popped out on this road that looked suddenly like an extremely well-maintained road. And I realised that this wasn't quite what I was expecting. And I cycled along a little bit further and I just saw this triple-layered security fence topped with barbed wire and security cameras. And behind it was the building and it looked very well-maintained. And I realised at this point that probably I shouldn't be there. As I started to turn around, a guy popped out of a bush with a Kalashnikov and pointed it at me and shouted at me to stop, which I did. And then he detained me and questioned me for the next couple of hours. And I was using Google Translate as my way to do it. Now, I look back now, this is pretty reckless and pretty silly. But yeah, I did manage to see the site where the Soviet Union ended.
Amazing stuff. Now, later on in that travel, you visited occupied Crimea. I think you went to, amongst other places, Sevastopol. But in Sevastopol, you met a cafe owner. You were with your guide and interpreter who had Russian heritage. And this cafe owner said to you, we all know what Ukraine is doing to Russians in Odessa. And your guide said, I'm Russian, no one is doing anything to me. To which the cafe owner replied, perhaps you've just been brainwashed by Ukrainian propaganda. Now, I ask you, as an albeit very well-travelled outsider, but an outsider nonetheless, how common was it to see such firmly held views about experiences that had not been lived, i.e. this woman was just buying into the narrative? And how do you account for that?
The thing that triggered me to go and do this, Janie, was being in Estonia and discovering the story of the Bronze Soldier of Tallinn, which was this event in 2007 where a Soviet Red Army monument was moved from the city centre to a military cemetery. And it was matched with protests by ethnic Russian Estonians and a lot of provocation from Russian language media channels. I realised that history and the narrative history was very much contested in this region, and your notion of facts depended on which side you sat on. And that's really what sent me off doing this journey in the first place, to find out more. What I found in Ukraine was a much more nuanced approach to history, where events would have occurred, and most of the people I spoke to would be able to give me a fairly balanced interpretation of it, actually. And then when I crossed into Crimea, I found myself for the first time in a place that felt slightly oppressive. Everywhere along this journey, I'd been put in touch with people through friends or friends of friends. When I got to Crimea, the person that I'd been put in touch with met me beneath the Lenin statue in Simferopol, and she immediately said, follow me. And I was with Artyom, the guy that you spoke of. He's from Odessa, he's Ukrainian, but his heritage is Russian. And he was translating. And this woman took me into a cafe and said, look, I can't stay with you for very long. I've only stayed in Crimea to look after my mum. The FSB follow me. They'll be following you too. Don't trust anybody. Goodbye. And so that was my first experience of being in Crimea. So it immediately started to feel a bit more oppressive. When I would meet people in Crimea, I'd ask them things, and they often sort of quite quickly shut off. You could tell that they were afraid of possibly saying the wrong thing. This was in 2018. And then every now and again, I'd bump into people who were quite clearly had a very strong view about what was going on, including a guy who was just in a bar down in Yalta who was talking about all the awful things the Russian government were doing, how he was trying to organise protests. He was telling me about people who were getting locked up. When I was in Bakhchisarai, which is the old Tatar capital in the centre of Crimea, there was a World War II memorial that was being polished up. And he said, well, they're doing this everywhere here. They're just trying to bring back World War II Soviet history. And then he was telling me about some friends of his neighbours whose son had been detained for protesting against Russian occupation because they were starting to impinge upon Tatar rights in Crimea. And he said the FSB turned up at the house of the mother of this person who'd been detained and said, you've got another son, haven't you? Well, if you want to keep him, stop asking where your first son had gone. So in Crimea, I certainly felt that there was this fear of people speaking openly. And every now and again, I'd encounter things like this lady in the shop who said that to Artyom. And Artyom said, look, I'm a Russian from Odessa. I can tell you this isn't happening. And she said, well, maybe you've been brainwashed by Ukrainian propaganda. And he said, well, maybe if I'm from Odessa, I'm the one telling you that perhaps the propaganda is coming from here.
Well, how did she respond to that?
She stopped speaking to us and asked us. Well, she didn't ask us to leave. We realised it was definitely time to leave.
Don't order the fish.
Don't order the fish.
I was really interested in your point there about these symbols and statues. And you mentioned Estonia. Well, the Victory Day parade on Friday, that's it, sort of deep down the rabbit hole. But of course, how we in the West relate to the Second World War. And this week of Victory in Europe week, 80 years this week, we were allies, maybe small a, but allies with the Soviet Union. So a lot of these symbols, and Francis, you'll probably have an interesting take on this. Please don't mention Napoleon. Yeah, a lot of these symbols are right to be still marked and, dare I say it, celebrated. I don't want to say there are legitimate concerns. Legitimate is a very contestable term. But how understandable are these concerns? How empathetic do you have to be to understand the concerns over such issues as the removal of Second World War Soviet war memorials, for example?
Well, you mentioned empathy there, Dom, and I think that's very much the value of travelling to these places and seeing them in person. Being in Estonia and understanding that this is a memorial, the bronze soldier this is, to people who had, in the Soviet view, liberated Estonia from the Russians. But to Estonians, it was the beginning of 45 years of occupation. They didn't want it in the centre of their town. And it wasn't until I'd gone to Estonia in 2017 as a reservist that I'd really understood what had happened to Estonia in the run-up to and during World War II. The narrative that we have of World War II, the sort of simplistic jingoistic narrative, is Germany invaded Poland, we got together, and then we worked with the Soviets to defeat Nazi Germany. But of course, the Soviets allied, or at least didn't contest the Nazi invasion of Poland under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, where they divided up Europe. And it was the Baltic states that ended up suffering immediately under the Soviets, and then under Nazi occupation, and then later under Soviet occupation again. So the way we commemorate and memorialise stuff through monuments and symbols can give people viewing them and perceiving them a sense of what is right and what is the just way of talking about something. So even if you're not necessarily pulling down or destroying monuments, at the very least giving them some sort of explanation. And I feel that the idea of moving the Bronze Soldier of Tallinn to a military cemetery felt an appropriate way to deal with that. They didn't destroy the monument, they just moved it to somewhere else.
But that was still hugely controversial, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was hugely controversial, particularly for Russian-speaking Estonians who felt that it was an attack on their sense of rights and their sense of validity of being in Estonia, many of whom had built lives over many generations and many of whom were born there. And so history is going to be contested. And I think the only thing we can really do to deal with these things well is to have a continuous dialogue. What was interesting is after I did this journey, I then chose to study strategic communications, so the use of words, images, actions and non-actions to change beliefs and behaviours. And one of our lecturers was telling us about the way Russia had used the Soviet calendar, reinterpreted it and changed memories and dates, drawing from the Soviet past to tell new stories about the Russian present and drawing back to the past on that. And Victory Day seems to be one of these things that has been used to go from being the way we view Victory Day, or we view remembrance as a memory of time and looking after or remembering the soldiers, into this much more jingoistic, nationalistic celebration of conquest and militarism and violence. And I was in Russia for the May Day parade in 2018, just before it actually, and speaking to people about that time. And there's this real sense of 1939 to 45 being the present, or particularly 41 to 45 being in the present for them. You go to St. Petersburg and the stories of the siege of Leningrad are very prominent. They're everywhere. And that's very different to what I encountered in Ukraine, which seemed to be looking more towards the future, trying to reinterpret itself as a nation.
Ash, thanks so much for your time today. Just on this fascinating subject, I think I agree with you. It's very striking. I visited Russia many, many years ago. Obviously, we won't be able to visit Russia anytime soon, having been sanctioned by the state. But one of the things that really does strike you being there is the degree to which the Second World War, the Great Patriotic War, as they describe it, is very much recent history. And there are many reasons for that we've talked about on the podcast previously, which is if you imagine that you've had decades of a project which failed, communism, you have to find the next great success. And the next great success that the Russians jumped on was the Great Patriotic War. Hence why we've seen this revival in recent years by Putin's regime, and indeed the renaissance in Stalin's reputation and the restoration of his statues. And it's on that point, actually, that I wanted to throw an idea out there, which is that, of course, we've seen throughout this war Putin point to the activities of what Ukraine has done to Soviet monuments, and indeed Estonia and many other former Soviet countries, and said this is a reason why we need to, as it were, antagonize them and, inverted commas, liberate them, because their actions by denouncing Soviet memorials is some of them validating the Nazi cause. And yet I find this a very strange argument, because as you've been pointing out, the Russians themselves are constantly reanalyzing, refreshing their history and their interpretations of the events. And the largest statue parks I've ever seen anywhere in the world are in Moscow and St. Petersburg. And there are effectively fields of Soviet-era statues that were taken down after the collapse of communism and basically all just moved to one place. I remember one very vividly stuck out with me. I was talking about Stalin there a moment ago. This was, I believe, in St. Petersburg. There was a huge park and there were about 3 or 4 very large statues of Stalin just sort of shoved in a corner. And then there were hundreds, and I'm not exaggerating, hundreds of heads of Stalin that had clearly been removed from other statues and then all bundled together and made into a sort of pile of skulls. And it was quite something. And so it is very, very strange. And this is why we need to be very skeptical whenever Russia says, that its Soviet past, its great history is being denounced. And recently, we saw the Kremlin pushing out this narrative that the current European Union is behaving like Nazi Germany in various ways. Well, actually, their own history is about repraising things. I mean, I would say that the current Kremlin regime is the most fascistic in Europe in the way that it is operating, and yet it is using history in the ways that you describe in order to push narratives that it thinks will advance its own cause and, in so doing, weaken the hands of other European nations. But it points to the shifting memory as being a reason why it justifies its military activity.
Yeah, the point you made about the that sounds amazing, that statue of the Stalin heads. When I was in Crimea, I went to Yalta, which strangely is twinned with Margate.
Did not know that.
Yeah, apparently it was a suggestion of Stalin at the beginning of the Yalta conference in 1945 to Churchill.
Oh man, am I going to win the pub quiz now?
And after this incident in Crimea, I didn't really know what to do, so I did what any British Army reservist does on holiday and did a battlefield study and followed the route of the 1854-55 invasion, or the Alliance invasion, and ended up down in Yalta. Outside the Levadia Palace, where the Yalta Conference of 1945 had been held, there is this very famous statue of a photograph of Roosevelt, Churchill and Stalin. And I was looking at it and taking some photos, and this guy came up and started chatting to me. He'd been a Russian Air Force fighter pilot and now flew for Aeroflot. And he was saying, well, what do you think of this statue? I was like, well, I suppose it's, it's quite a dramatic statue of an interesting time. He said, Stalin's not a bad leader. I thought that was an interesting take, given what we know of Stalin's history. And he said, but this was the moment that the world respected us, when the 3 great powers sat down together and sorted out the problems of the small nations. And that's what Russia wants again. I found that interesting because that probably wasn't a history that he'd been taught or a narrative he'd been taught at school. So it indicated to me a sort of pervasive, zeitgeisty narrative that must have been being pushed in Russia, which is, in 2018, what we want again is the great powers to sit down with us at the table, which was, maybe that's exactly what Putin might achieve if he ends up having his conversations with Trump.
Now, Ash, many of the travels you took place in, obviously this was several years ago, and if a week's a long time in politics, these years have really seen a seismic shift in some of these countries that you travel through. And I wonder if you could just comment on that, sort of particularly when you were in the north, in the Baltic states. How do you account for the shift that's taken place since those times, and how do you reflect on them?
Yeah, I've been back to Estonia a couple of times since then, and I've just noticed they've always seemed to have a reality check about what Russia is up to and what Russia's like, dating back through the period of Russian Tsarist occupation and then Soviet occupation, and then what's happened to them since 2007 onwards. And I think they've just maybe been pleased that the rest of the world has woken up to that a bit. I travelled through Finland, spent some time up there, and then did a documentary last year about Finland joining NATO. And this realisation in that region as well, which is the same, which is almost as if, look, we told you can't trust these guys, so just be a bit careful. And I think those are the shifts that I have seen. I'd like to get back to Ukraine. I think once they get a peace that they want, tourism to Ukraine is going to be a great way to help them redevelop, help put revenue back into the country. And it's an awesome place. Beyond the dark tourism that will occur to see like the legacies of conflict and going to the front line and so on. It's a beautiful country with an amazing deep history that's complex, with fabulous subcultures and differences from one region to the next. Just awesome, welcoming people too.
If only we knew someone who could talk us through it. Thanks, Ash. One more for me before we go to final thoughts. So to bring it right up to the present. So you, in your book, and this is only one chapter of your book. So the book is much wider. Why We Travel: A Journey into Human Motivation. It's much more. It's not a travelogue, history, security book about Ukraine. It draws out many of the points. In the book, you relate conversations you have with people in the town, for example, of New York, just southwest of Toretsk, which has been fought over many times and still incredibly violent today. So how are you still in touch with any of these people? Do you know how they got on? The characters that you introduce us to in the book, do you know what happened to them?
Yeah, I mean, the one friend that I still stay in touch with most regularly is a guy called Max. And Max in 2014 had been backpacking around Nepal. And when he heard about what was happening in Crimea and then Donbass, he got on a plane back, volunteered and went out to Donbass to fight, trained in reconnaissance. He fought for several years in that conflict. By the time I met him in 2018, he'd retired from the army and was working as a guide in the mountains, showing me around, telling me the history of that region. When 2022 happened, he went straight back into the army. Out fighting in Donbass, been fighting down in Kherson. He's currently training other soldiers. So he's doing okay, although he would much rather not be fighting his war. And I think he's just very tired of the fact that he has to keep defending his country from Russian invasion. But he'll keep going, because he knows that the alternative would be far worse. New York was an amazing place to go and visit. Russian is the first language in that region. And the people that had started the insurrection in 2014 came from that town. And I met the mayor, started the insurrection in that town. I met the mayor and he'd said, the people who started this insurrection were the down and outs, they were the disenfranchised, they were the disgruntled. And then he picked up a rifle, came into my office and said they were taking over the town. Eventually they got pushed back out by the Ukrainian armed forces. And he said, now they're over there in a ditch, and I hope they're happy looking at us from over there. But we want to build a town that is part of the Ukrainian nation, and the way we do it is by engaging with the rest of the country. And it's just tragic that they are now fighting for that town once again.
Thanks, Ash. Come back to you for final thoughts in a moment. But book launch on Thursday in Piccadilly. We'll put some details in the episode notes. Everyone's invited on Thursday night. Go along to that. But Francis, where do you want to leave us with final thoughts?
Well, thanks, Dom. Just a quick note that obviously it was a public holiday here in Britain yesterday. In case you missed it, we did a special Q&A episode. We filmed it as well. So if you listen to it and you want to see a video version of us in the studio, then do check out the link in the show notes, which we'll add in. Lots of questions from around the world. And as we always say, we do read every message. It was nice to have the opportunity to actually answer some of those that have come in the inbox in recent weeks. Dom talked about what it's like being shot at in a tank. We were also asking what would happen if the US did suddenly stop supporting Ukraine. Why do missiles do more damage in Ukraine than in Israel? What could give the coalition of the willing more bite? Is 2025 the year the Russian economy finally collapses? So lots of different questions, and as I say, we're very grateful for them, and as well to everybody who has signed up to the newsletter, which we will be, I think our first one will be going out this week if we find enough to talk about. So thanks to everybody who's done that, and we'll have a link in the show notes to that too.
Thanks, Francis. Just from me, tomorrow night, so Wednesday, at the Curzon Theatre in Bloomsbury, I'm going to be moderating a panel organised by Ukrainian Action. They've been leading on a film called Taras about a Ukrainian champion snowboarder, Taras, who volunteered, went and fought in the war, and has returned to the Carpathian Mountains to rest his mind and recuperate. So it's his story. I'm going to be moderating a panel after that with various people to discuss all about the war and veterans rehabilitation and the challenges yet to come. So if you are around, again, central London, tomorrow night at the Curzon Theatre in Bloomsbury, have a look at my social media feed. You'll see all the bobbins in there to sign up and come along. But Ash, as our guest, as ever, would you like the final thought?
Thank you, Don. Thank you, Francis. I do work in defence and security now, but travel was what started me in journalism. And we travel for all these different reasons, some for ourselves, some to develop ourselves as people, and some is to understand a region more. And we can gain a lot and develop ourselves through doing that. I first went to Ukraine in 2018. The first phase of the war was 4 years old at that point. And now, for most people, we only know of Ukraine through the latest stage of the conflict since 2022. But at some point, they will hopefully get the peace that they want. And at that point, I hope people use travel to do good things, to go to Ukraine and understand what it is beyond a place that has just been invaded by Putin, and to put their money back into the economy, because it's a great way to help a place rebuild.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, Please subscribe to the Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine Live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow the Telegraph so you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Phil Atkins. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells and David Knowles.